Hey everybody, welcome to page 158. This is our living room, and we have the fabulous Scott Gates here today. We've known Scott for a few years now. He met us during one of our book festivals a couple of years ago, and he's been a writer for a long time. And he writes a great blog post that if you have a chance to today, if you're not doing anything else, please go see it. It's really interesting. Scott is a true Southern gentleman. Every time he comes into the store with the kids, he's kind and considerate and just somebody you want to go out and have a drink with. So
Yeah,
thank you so much, Scott, for coming. And yeah, we're going to be open 5 years this July, and we love being part of such a great community. Wake Forest is a great place to raise a family and be a part of so many friends and community members. We really have felt the love the last couple months. And like I said before, for a couple of years now, Scott and his family have come into the store, and I've gotten to know him a little bit, and I hope to get to know him more. After reading the book, I feel like I know you a lot better. I love the way your mind thinks. You're originally from Montgomery, Alabama, and you've been a writer. Your blog is The Incidentalist, Field Notes from the American South, and you write it with your brother, and it's fascinating. I really like it. On May 5th, this book was published. Isn't this beautiful? Love this. Scott, tell us about the cover.
So that's pretty cool. And by the way, mutual love for page 158. Our kids love your train table and your books. But it's just a great place. And I feel like, so the publisher, I'm going way off on a tangent here, but the publisher is local. They're Raleigh-based, Blue Ink Press. So I feel so blessed because I have a local publisher, and now I feel like I've gained a relationship with my local bookstore too, just as we get to know each other better. So I feel pretty lucky here. But yeah, I'm glad you made the cover because Craig, my brother, he does the blog with me. That's something we started a few years back. My wife and I were in Northern Virginia for about 10 years. And when we moved to North Carolina about 4 years ago, I realized that I had not been in the South for far too long. So that's kind of the Incidentalist kind of grew out of that because my brother and I were talking. I was like, there's so much I need to write about now because of just like day-to-day experiences that I'd forgotten about, just, you know, how folks are down here. So, that was kind of a nice little creative project for us to work on together. And then he took a real interest in the book as I started writing it, and we would bounce ideas off each other. And I feel like he was really invested in it. So when he was really excited to know that it was getting published, and when it came time to start, he's a graphic designer. So when it came time to start thinking about the cover, I again was bouncing some ideas off of him, and he very politely was like, "You want me to just mock something up for you?" And of course I did. And it, again, with Blue Ink being an independent publisher, they were very open to the idea of Craig doing the cover, and it worked out. So that's really special for both of us because, you know, now we have this other creative endeavor that we've both been able to contribute to. So, and it's beautiful. I love it.
It is. I think you need t-shirts to go along with this tour that you're doing.
Oh, there you go.
I think it would be beautiful. How is this book tour coming? Since May 5th, how has the response been to the book?
You know what?
It's like no other book tour, really. I mean, this is not the time to drop a book, but I think you're doing well selling the book.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, so, you know, hearing other authors, I think they will say the same thing. Now's the time when, at least if nothing else, people are inside and they're reading more, unless you have kids who you're trying to homeschool at home like us. But, for the most part, you know, there's some quiet moments you didn't have before, so people are reading books, so that's a good thing. And right now it's exciting because a lot of my friends are reading it, and others who've gotten a hold of it and heard about it. And so it's this cool time because it's gone from an idea and these characters that have been in my head for years, and now they're out in the world, and I can talk to my buddies about, you know, Jeb Mosby and Solomon Dykes, and it's pretty nice. So that's a good feeling, definitely.
I just want to read this one review that I saw today. It's from Jean Fredrickson, who has an online blog also, and also lives in Wake Forest. She said, there is something joyful about small presses that work with their authors to produce excellent books. The marriage of an attentive small press and a mesmerizing tale is unquestionably felt in Scott Gates' debut novel, Hard Road South, and Blue Ink Press of Raleigh, North Carolina. The union has produced a story that will satisfy historical fiction fans and appeal to readers who have craved stories that, at their core, are timeless about human nature and its need for good. That just encapsulates it. The book is incredible. And June, you hit the nail on the head. There's quite a long review here. I'm not going to bore you with me reading to you, but she summed it up perfectly. How did you come up with this idea? Because this time period is talked a lot about, but this really gets to that gray area. And I love the characters. I love the focus of the characters and what they want to do.
Well, thanks. Yeah. So when I started it, it was before we had kids, so I had a little time to think. And and we were living in Northern Virginia, like I mentioned. And so Northern Virginia, growing up in Alabama, Civil War history especially is all around. And I grew up visiting battlefields and things like that. My grandfather would tell stories about, great uncles who were involved in the war. But in Northern Virginia, it's amazing because despite all the development up there are these little pockets of history that you can find. One of them, which is Middleburg, which is the setting of the book, which is a gorgeous area. It's out just on the other side of the ridge from the Shenandoah Valley. So it's not the Shenandoah Valley, but close to it. And it's just this rolling pasture land. They have stone walls everywhere still. And so that's pretty inspiring in itself. But also it's called the Red Fox Inn now. There's a tavern that's visited frequently in the book at the time, a beverage house. So that's a real place you can go visit. So I think for one, that kind of the setting came from that because I was there and it was interesting to me, the history of it. And then the idea of that time period was interesting to me because, you hear a lot about the Civil War, those core, just those few years during the war. You don't hear too much about the aftermath aside from whatever you get in, junior high about Reconstruction, which always felt kind of stuffy and weird and political. And I never quite understood what was going on. And so I, started thinking about it and I was like, well, despite all the political nonsense going on, people were in a weird place, just think about, major events like what's going on now, just how what's that? But how people react to it differently and how we're going to recover from it going forward. So I kind of got in that mindset. I was like, for one, there's going to be veterans and they're all dealing with their issues. There's a lot of amputees walking around after the war. So that kind of thing I just kind of wove throughout. It's just part of life is all these kind of wounds from the war that show up in subtle ways and some not so subtle ways.
Mm-hmm. I love the pacing of this. And we have a couple comments on here too, that it's not rushed. You actually feel like you're part of the story and you feel like you're friends with them. How did you go about getting the pacing down and telling the story, not to rush everything? And because sometimes people it's overstimulating and it's like all over the place. Like you're very smooth and it flows.
Well, thanks. Yeah, probably because I had no idea where it was going when I started it. So I thought I had no clue what the ending was going to be when I started out. I didn't even know what was going to happen to the main characters. I kind of just put them in the world and it's an easy thing to say, but just, a lot of writers will say they don't know what's going to happen to the characters until they start writing. But that's pretty much how it went. It was really interesting, the process. But I do kind of plan chapter by chapter. So after a certain point, I could tell, okay, this is where it's going. And then I would, map out from there the rest of the book, or at least it's broken into 3 seasons. It's kind of over a season. Starts in the spring, goes over the summer, and then ends in the fall. So that was one way for me to organize it and also set the pacing because obviously, we're set within this time frame of seasons. So I don't know. That's kind of how I worked it in my head.
Now, do you plot it all out with yellow sticky notes everywhere, or just generally knocking it out in a notebook? Or
I wish there was some bulletin board covered in like brilliant ideas with strings between each one, but it was really just, I had a Word doc and chapter framework would be, I know that in this, well, first of all, there's 2 points of view that alternate. Usually it's some chapters are from Jeb Mosby's point of view, the Virginia farmer. Some chapters are from Solomon Dyke's point of view, the Connecticut veteran. He's a Union War veteran, come down from Connecticut to Virginia. A carpetbagger, for a lack of a better word, although not malicious. Most carpetbaggers were coming down from the north during Reconstruction to take advantage of a situation that they saw was vulnerable. These folks were in a rough spot and there was opportunities to take advantage of that. Some came down with, like Solomon Dykes, with the good intent to help out, do some good, or just saw an opportunity to kind of start fresh in a place that was going through some exciting changes. So that was where he was coming from. Anyway, so I would, in the chapter map, I would make a note, whose point of view is it in, and then what do they need to do? And I'm talking about bare bones notes, like Jeb goes to the tavern and Harlan Kirkbride says some mean stuff. Harlan is kind of he's like a landowner in the area that here's kind of the seedy underbelly of the times. Him and I have vastly differing opinions on the world. Anyway, it'd just be short notes like that. And then I'd kind of go from there.
Well, you really nailed it. Like, even the characters, they're not caricatures of people. It's not like, here's the bad guy from the north and here's the good guy. It's just, it flows. And in your acknowledgments in the back of the book, you talk about your pop and your and his wife, Emmy Lou, who's your granny, and they were inspiration and they told you a lot of stories. Whereas some of those based on people, can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. I know some family members who might read this will pick up on a few. They might be like, oh, that's one of those things Pop used to talk about. It's not
if they were listening, you were.
It's not right. It was hard not to listen to him. He was actually the Incidentalist. The blog name, again, was inspired by Pop, because his perfect transition to keep talking about whatever he wanted was, incidentally, blah, 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 and he'd go on from there. So he could finish talking about like an Auburn football game, but then just take a breath and go, incidentally, there's this story about my father that it just totally, non sequitur, but that's the magic word that ties it all together. So anyway, he would tell, like I said, he would tell stories about family, and there's actually one instance with uniform buttons. That's probably the one that's the most that's the one true family story that's actually in there. They're one of our the great uncle who fought in the war. After the war, he had a uniform coat, and it was the insignia were they were outlawed because it was they'd lost. So you couldn't go around wearing Confederate uniforms, after they'd lost the war. So that comes up in the book. It's just again, another small thing that you wouldn't necessarily, an instance where you wouldn't, it's another one of those wounds from the war. It's just a small matter. It's a big deal for some because it's just wearing on their.
But you got into their head and explained it so well. You could understand it and gives the character empathy in 3 dimensions, because when you're learning about it in junior high, you learn 1 dimension, but this, I wish there were books like this that kids had to read in school, because it makes it all understandable. So, and there were people involved, and people are not numbers. So. Right.
Oh yeah. Yeah. That was, and they're no different than we are today. They were just living in a different time. So, and yeah, they might talk a little different, but really, I mean, put yourself in their shoes and that's the experience, So I did want to ground it that way, because it's foreign to us, and it was more than 100 years ago, but they weren't so different. They were just living in a different time and place. So
no, and I read somewhere recently that we tend to think of people from 100 years ago or even more, like anybody in the past is always dumber than we are, and that's not true. And I think that's like one of the main parts of this book that you get. It's we're all the same, you know, and history repeats itself. And
Yeah.
yeah.
I'm glad that.
So, yeah. Have you always wanted to write this book? Has this been something that's been going on in your head since you listened to your pop?
Not this book, no. And my brother reminded me recently of a conversation I'd had with my dad. I forgot this. This was probably when I was in college. I think I was just amazed that anybody could sit down and write a novel, because I was writing at the time. I was writing more personal essays and short stories, and that I could handle. But then in doing that, you know, I'd hit 3,000 words and be wiped out. So I didn't know how anybody could just do that long form. And he had said at the time, "Oh, go for it. It's just a bunch of short stories all tied together." Which in writing it, it's a bunch of chapters tied together. I mean, short stories are a little more, for me at least, it's a little more, you have to be a little more meticulous with the language, because you only have so much space to get your point across.
Mm-hmm.
Like with a longer book, you have a little more room to play with, but it is definitely just chapter by chapter slogging away. So I never would have, you know, I never really thought that I could sit down and write something long form like this, but I just sat down one day and started writing a story, and it felt like something more than an essay or a short story, and it kept going. So,
well, I'm glad you did. And your wife Kelly has been very helpful with you and encouraging you. Is there another book that you're researching and writing now?
Yeah, actually, I don't know why okay, I kind of do. So it's more historical fiction. This one is set in 1898, and it's a little more upbeat, just because I personally needed it more upbeat. But it's set out west. So again, it's an interesting transition, because, you know, this transition was the South after the war. The transition out there is kind of old West to new West. You know, you have a lot of towns that are strung up with lights, like electric lights, but you also you go out in the country some, and people are still, there's still hints of the Wild West, you know. So I just think that's kind of those like transition periods. I think there's some stories in there that aren't often told. So that's what interests me.
I totally agree with you. Yeah. So I lost my train of thought.
She supports, like, she has to put up with me spouting random plot points every now and again, and she's always very supportive and stops and talks through those things with me.
And your brother too. And the kids. You know, have the kids help you write stuff.
Yeah.
They have great plot.
My daughter is really good with names. She comes up with great character names. She'll just like throw them out. So there's some character names that are starting to sneak into books that she came up with. So, well,
that's cool.
Yeah.
Is there a section that you decided you wanted to read from this? I know I gave you like 10, but
sure. So tell me. Okay, so you mentioned page 158.
That's usually what we go to, because that's the name of our store. But the ones I really love were page 132.
But I just like the idea of you making us go to page 158. Not that we don't have to do that. I just thought that was a cool.
There's so many, like I have so many. I'm one of those people that dog ears books, and I probably get a lot of heck from it. But it's just because I love them, and those little sticky things fall off. But one of my favorite parts too is page 177. I mean, I know you had said there was something at the beginning that you loved. It was a country scene, and that sounds beautiful, and it goes with the cover. So
yeah, I might just read just a little bit of that. I don't want to.
Okay.
It's Jeb Mosby. So he's the cover. When I saw it, this is a painting by. Sorry, I'm looking for it now. Oh, Winslow Homer. Sorry. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so this is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and he did a lot of paintings that people might recognize. You might be surprised in that time period. So this is called Veteran in a New Field. And when I saw it, I did not know about it until after the book, when I was looking for cover images. And it's just perfect. And that, in my mind, that's Jeb Mosby. Actually, it even syncs with a kind of pivotal scene with Jeb. Mm-hmm. Not this scene. So this is a little snapshot of life with Jeb and his wife, Fanny, here kind of toward the beginning of the book.
What page is this?
Page 42. Chapter 5. All right. White feathers were strewn across the ground, tracing a path out from the chicken pen. Ah, now don't tell me that, Mosby muttered. Well, hell. He ducked through a splayed hole in the thin wire fence and peered inside the coop. One hen was tucked in a dark corner, nestled over a patch of straw. Another was alive, but crumpled on the floor, its wing fixed at an unnatural angle. 2 hens and the rooster missing. He pulled his head out and surveyed the yard. The rooster was scratching at a piece of ground a dozen yards away. All else was quiet. The feathers were likely the only mementos of the other hens. Mosby slipped through the hole in the fence and bent it back as best he could, crimping the edges over each other. He fixed his gaze on the rooster and hoisted his pants up. He went into a half squat and crept toward the oblivious bird. Within a few feet of it, he leapt, arms outstretched. He landed squarely on the rooster, which shrieked in surprise and immediately started working its spurs into his chest. Mosby sprang up, holding the writhing bird at arm's length by its feet. And just what were you doing last night when those dogs made off with our hens? The rooster, unmoved by the rebuke, continued to thrash. Mosby walked back into the pen, through the gate this time, and tossed the rooster into a far corner. He ducked in and grabbed the injured hen by the feet and turned back toward the house, latching the gate behind him. He paused at the woodpile by the porch and studied a few logs. He hefted a medium-sized piece and held it up for further inspection. Pleased with it, he lifted the bird and with a quick, hard swing, struck it in the head with the log. He put the log back and walked in through the porch. Fanny was making breakfast in the kitchen when Mosby walked in. Dogs were back last night, he said. Oh, Lord, what did they do? Made a mess of the chicken coop and supped on 2 of our hens. He hoisted the third up by its legs. Looks like this one goes to us. She was badly broken when I found her. Chicken dinner? Consider it a surprise treat. But without Pappy. Her eyes tracked the limp chicken as Mosby tossed it onto the table. I'm hopeful, Fanny. I know it looks bad, but I'm hopeful. He's never been out through a night before. Where would he sleep if he's not in town? I don't know, but he'll make do, Butternut. I spread word in town, and he's bound to come across someone before too long. They'll get him back safely to us. Fanny didn't look convinced. Okay, look, after I'm done with the creek field, I'll hitch up fresh and take another look around. Fanny sighed. And I suppose I get to pluck this hen today? I'll plow, you pluck. Deal? She wrinkled her nose. Fine. But I want Pappy at the table tonight. I shall do my best. Mosby kissed her on a rosy cheek. I'll be in for breakfast after I finish a few more chores. He turned and went back outside through the porch. He and Fanny had been up late the night before, waiting. Mosby had just assumed Pappy would turn up in town that afternoon, but he found not a trace of him. Mosby had lingered as long as possible, running his errands, spreading word of Pappy's wandering, but in the end, he returned home empty-handed. It had been years since Mosby had gone to bed with that kind of worry on his mind, and never about Pappy. Pappy would disappear from time to time, but typically either walk in for dinner or turn up before sundown in the barn or a close field. Once, last fall, he had wandered a piece down the road toward town, but never any further. This was the longest he'd been out, and Mosby knew his father's mind was faded and ill-equipped for any kind of long journey. He likely carried nothing with him, not a possession, a plan, or even a song to travel by, for he could no longer remember the words to his favorite hymns. And I'll end there.
Isn't that beautiful? And you just get it right. Like, he calls his wife Fanny, but he calls her Butternut. So you're right there. I smelt the chicken coop. I heard everything. I mean, it's beautiful writing. And I'm so proud of you. Like, this is just, I had nothing to do with it. I'm just, it's beautiful. Really good.
Yeah. Interesting thing here. So Pappy, Jeb's father, has wandered off. That's kind of how the book starts. And that to me is interesting too, because he clearly has dementia or Alzheimer's, and we know that now, but at the time that wasn't an illness to be diagnosed. So, in the book, I can progress through his symptoms, which worsen through the season.
Yeah.
I just thought that was interesting to me. Yet another point where these folks are dealing with the same thing we are. It's just different time. So
exactly. Yeah, and you don't hit people over the head with the answers. You let them figure it out themselves too. So that was good. We are gonna let some questions in, and there's also on the bottom of the screen you can hit buy the book button, and Scott has generously offered to sign 4,000 of them, and we're gonna send them out today. No, but we've sent a lot out, and we have more going out. So Scott, let's ask. Why don't you tell people like why you're so excited about this book and why they definitely need to buy it today? No.
Okay. Well, if you haven't picked up
Is
on
there like a message for people that you want?
what's that?
A message for people that you want to get out of it, or is it just
okay. Kind of like what I've mentioned. This is a period in our history that I don't think is explored enough, and so that's why I enjoyed writing within it. I do. To that end, I think that, like I mentioned, I didn't want to get into politics. There's no way I was going near that. There's some references in there just because it's inevitable. It's the current events of the day. But
I think either side you're on, you're going to look at this book like, okay, I have a better understanding of what people were going through. So I don't think it's going to cause any fire, because there's still fire going on about this, But
I didn't want to touch that, and don't want to get near any of that. But right, it's just like boil it down. It's just about the people, and so I was looking to just share some experiences of people living their lives after the war. Some have lost loved ones in the war. Some never, some never recovered emotionally or personally after the war themselves, those who had to fight. So just looking at that, it's a little snapshot in this very, special community in a beautiful place, and just kind of gets at some of the hardships they're dealing with day to day. And to make it all the more interesting, let's bring a carpetbagger in and see what happens. So yeah.
So tell me, the only problem I have with this back and forth, and I wish we were live right now, is because of the echo and feedback. And this is working out well, but I'm sure you didn't imagine this was going to be your book tour. So
no,
we're doing a great job.
I hope I'm not having any problems. You're sounding good, so I hope.
Okay. Yeah. Well, you look good and you're sounding good too, and we have a lot of people on here, so this is great.
Good. But this is not ideal. And I think seeing other authors do things like this, and I mean, you guys for doing this, like for you could have just canceled the event. So
no, this is my favorite part of this. Interacting with authors. I'd love to get in your head.
Well, and I'm grateful for that, and I'm sure other authors are too. I know they are. So I just think this is very cool that you can adapt, and we're doing what we can in the time. So
yes. How are you doing with all this, the homeschooling? Are your kids going to be little writers?
Oh, goodness. They are very creative and they have great ideas. The homeschooling is, we have three kids under the age of, 7 and down and below. Our youngest is 1.5 years. So it's I'm stifling the twitches right now. It's a quiet house. This is why I'm so comfortable right now. It's the first quiet I've had in a while. But it's challenging. And I've heard other authors will talk about how they're in similar situations. And you see all the things that are like, oh, this is such a great time to just be creative, and you have all this extra time on your hands. But that's not everybody's experience. So I know, like for me, I am writing when I can, but usually I do that at night after the kids are in bed. And lately, I just don't have much left. So it hasn't been, I'm getting back. I'm getting back in kind of a groove. But I'm hearing from kind of the writing community is that
I'm hearing a lot of people having a hard time concentrating, even reading, writing, or anything. So
yeah, because it's easy to just drift back to the news feed or Facebook or whatever is headlines. But I've distanced myself from that now. So best I can. So staying informed, but not,
you can't. It's too much.
Yeah.
But you know what? Like, I think books like this are hopeful because and I'm not calling it simple. I'm calling the story simple. And our lives right now are not simple, but they are, like I'm trying to explain what this was a really hard time back then, and they overcame it. So that's why I think this book is hopeful, because that was really hard. They didn't have news. They didn't have washing machines. They didn't have like so many things that we take for granted, and they made it. Yeah. And they gave us the shoulders to climb on top of. So
this is
good, great book for this.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, we're going to open up to some questions here. Again, the buy button's on the bottom, and then there's a question line on there if you want to say anything. And look at all these comments. details. They love it. They love it. They love it. So, Dave, are you going to come back in and ask the questions?
Yep. Can you hear me okay?
Oh, there you are. We can hear you.
So there's a couple of questions here. The first one from Kate is, which came first, the plot, the characters, or the title?
Oh, title was like last. I had come up with a completely different title, and it didn't work in the end. So there's that answer. I would say, I guess characters came first. I had a good idea of, well, clearly the book starts off with Solomon Dykes on his journey, the Union veteran. So I knew that a guy was coming down from Connecticut to go south. He's kind of, the interesting thing there to me is that he's an optimist, not easily flapped from that, but he keeps hitting these obstacles. Like nothing really good is happening to him throughout the whole book. And so that was one thing in my mind. I think I wanted, for whatever reason, that was like, I'm going to write about a book about a good guy that bad things keep happening to. So it's not all bad, of course, but that was kind of the gist of him. And then Jeb developed quickly after that because I needed somebody to speak to the place where Solomon was going. So I needed a character who lived in the South and could, portray that. So it wasn't just, you said something to these lines too. It's not like, it's not just a foreign land. Like now we have, we're reading about two characters. One is a visitor, one is well familiar with it. Even the bad guys in the book, Jeb Mosby's friendly with because they're in the same community, so it's not just painting all the bad guys as the bad guys because, well, they can sit and have a beer with Jeb Mosby, but even though their intentions aren't the same as his would be. So characters first, plot developed from there, and then the title was dead last.
It's a perfect title. It really is. It drives home what it's
Last.
about. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. I mean, everybody was on a hard road almost. And, it's specific to Solomon's road because, and it's not like literally the road that he traveled to get from Connecticut to Virginia was rough. It wasn't the best trip, but it wasn't bad. But it's more his journey throughout, his journey to try to, one character, Cassius Freeman, is a freed slave, and he befriends Solomon Dykes. And so at one point, Cassius is pointing out to him, he's like, there's others in your position who are going about this the easy way, which would be to come down here and take advantage of us. You're going about this the hard way. There's merit to that, but it's not going to be a cakewalk. So that kind of is where the title spins out of. So I hope I answered that.
Dave? That was a good question.
Yeah.
Dave said he's just having some connection issues. I just thought of something that I had written down, and are there things that you learned about yourself when you were investigating that? Like things that your grandfather told you that you found out were real and you just were amazed by it, or?
Not so much about the history. I realized that I like historical fiction. Again, I'd never really written historical fiction before. So I realized I do like it. One, to put a face. Well, I mentioned I like exploring kind of transitionary periods that you don't hear much about. Two, to kind of personalize history and put a face on it.
We need that.
And three, it's handy. Like real history can be handy plot devices. Or they can kind of scuttle things too. One example on the other side of that is because I do want to, it's not all, you take liberties with it in some instances, but I wanted to get enough history right to where somebody, for example, we ran it by a few historians in the Middleburg area. I didn't want them to scoff and toss it down after page 4 because it was just so incorrect and inaccurate. I didn't want that at all. So I tried to get enough right to where it held its own without being burdensome history, But in one instance, so I'd started out the book and I was like, okay, what's a good period after the Civil War? Maybe 6 or 7 years, because I want it to have cooled a bit, So I think I put it 7 years out in like 1871. When he's in New York's interesting to me to view it in that time period. But he goes through Grand Central Station, which was new, and it was it's amazing building, and so it had these soaring ceilings and glass above, and it was just like this architectural marvel. So I described that, and so then I'm writing, and then I get to the, I don't know, chapter 20 something, like way back toward the end, and I realized that by 1871 Virginia had been readmitted to the Union. So there was a period where it was technically an occupied foreign nation, I guess you could say. I mean, they call it like a military state. So that's what I wanted to capture, because that's a tense time. So all of a sudden I get out there and I'm like, oh, I got to go back a couple of years. So I changed it to 1869. Grand Central Station was built in 1870 or 71. So I got to like rewrite that whole part, because there's, we got to figure out how trains move from New York in 1869 at this point. So there's a point where, I probably could have just fudged it a little bit, but it's fun for me to research that and look at maps and figure out how he might have moved through the city. So,
well, I have to tell you, a lot of times the details are what makes it. And there was a lot of stuff going on in the whole world then. Like Russia had some big problems, and because I ran, there was just a lot of problems going on in the world. And I've read probably one of the most popular books lately. And a friend of mine and I were talking, I'm like, well, that doesn't even make sense. Has she ever been to North Carolina? So that can make or break the fact that I love a book. So I commend you for looking at the details, because it flowed, and you, like I said, you felt like you were there. All right, Dave?
Okay.
Do we have another question?
Yes. So another one was from Nick. You don't have to turn it to me.
I want to.
Nope.
Hey, Dave.
Do you have a particular character that you connected with closely?
Definitely Jeb. Although I'm an optimist, like Saul, Jeb, I think, has more. He's got a good sense of humor, but he gets frustrated and down about stuff. There's a lot of stuff happens to him on the farm over the course of the book. Just he's dealing with, his father used to help him out. He's not really capable anymore. His wife's busy with her own work. She can't pitch in too much out in the fields where he is. So he's pretty much keeping it together on his own, and that can be hard work and frustrating. And so you see points in the book where he gets frustrated by it, just kind of throws up his hands, and a few mild curse words might come out. I try to keep it relatively clean, but I probably relate to Jeb more than any of them. So
cool.
I liked him too.
Well, turn back to me. What kind of historical research did you do? And I think you talked a little bit about this, but and where did you do it?
So I would go. I know people, authors, writers do this in different ways, and some say don't get too bogged down with it. Just write it out and then circle back if you need to. I tend to, like I mentioned, how I'm going to frame it out by chapter. So I know that in chapter 3, Solomon is going to be working his way through Washington, D.C. So rather than just go for it and write that, I spent a lot of time reading about Washington, D.C. in that time period to figure out and looking at maps. Maps are huge for me, especially when characters are on the move, obviously. But just thinking about how he might move through the city, what he might encounter. At the time, Canal Street was a canal, and the Washington Monument was a stump. So, some of these things that are, that he might just happen upon, and it's not a big deal. It's just, you mentioned it in passing. But I like to have all that in my head, that historical groundwork, before I move on.
And it makes it interesting. If it's interesting and it catches your attention, it's interesting to us, because I didn't know all that.
Yeah, and it's just, I don't want to be too heavy-handed with it, but it's kind of like, I call them like historical Easter eggs, are all through the thing.
Yeah.
So, and like it's a transitionary period for everything too. Like there's Tabasco sauce pops up. I was looking for products that are familiar to us now that were new and exciting back then. Baseball, there's a game of baseball played. It's very rudimentary, they're not very good at it, but it's starting to get a hold in the country at that point. So a lot of that research is done online because it's easy. Since it was very specific to Loudoun County, Virginia, I felt like, well, there's a phenomenal website. Let me make sure I get it right. It's for that area, loudonhistory.org. So that was a great resource. But there's also some books that were more specific to the time and place that were helpful. So yeah, I pulled from a few different sources.
Dave and I will get a day off and we will go visit Civil War sites. They're beautiful. They give you chills, there's so many right around us too. So Dave, you have another one?
Yeah. So your brother Craig wanted to know how you came up with the intimate details that make the story come alive, like Fanny's nickname Butternut, or calling the lantern by its brand name, and commenting how the small things make it much more real.
And that he's the favorite brother. Right, Martha?
Talk about that. Can you get him?
Let's dive into that.
I'm only kidding.
So that's just another part of like Tabasco, just weaving in little bits of detail that flush it out a little bit, like the Lomax lantern. I mean, okay, so they have to light a fire, so they're going to use a match, right? But did they call it a match? So you got to go and look, and at the time, it was more like a Lucifer. They would refer to it as that. So all these little things, like I try to catch myself, like that was too easy. Is this really how that would have played out? Do they have access to these things? And Butternut, as far as nicknames, I don't know. He's on a farm, so just try to think of a nice, like I was probably thinking through vegetables, like, what's a cute vegetable name? And I think Butternut stuck. So
that's a good
better
one.
than a little zucchini, right?
Yeah.
So let's see. Again, the attention to detail is wonderful. One of my favorite characters. Keep on you. One of my favorite character details is about Jeb and how he eats food on his plate on page 163. And how did this type of detail come to you? How do you work through that?
Let's see. I'm curious what food he's eating. Is this? Let's see. This is in the tavern. There's another interesting thing. At the time, there weren't traditional restaurants, but you could get food out at taverns or eating houses, they would call them, which you come across toward the front of the book.
Curbside pick up with a horse. I'm only kidding. Yeah.
So I don't know. I did focus a lot on the food just because it's interesting to me, and I like Southern cooking. So I was kind of interested in what they might be eating. That's another question. I mean, because you sit them down at the dinner table, and then you're like, let me research what they might have had for dinner, and just because you want to get it right, So I would look at what is in season, vegetable wise, what they might have been able to pull from root cellars, what might still be around, because it was a different supply chain they were dealing with back then from what we have now. So
and pewter plates. So you're hearing the cut, the cutting on the silver plate, the pewter plate, and everything.
Oh, right.
So
yeah,
it's very distinctive. Great details. All right.
So there's another one. Why Virginia? And would the story be different if it was set in the Piedmont of Carolinas or Alabama Black Belt?
Yes, definitely. So Virginia, because I was there at the time, and I was writing to what I was experiencing. Middleburg is, like I said, is beautiful, and it just seemed like a really nice setting to write about. Now, as far as the era, it would have been vastly different if it had been in any number of states, just because everything from how they experienced, what they were experienced after the war, to how they experienced the war during the war, was varied from state to state and region to region. So I get into some of the Virginians' view of why they were fighting the war, which would be very different from North Carolinian or Alabama views of why they were fighting the war. So I would have changed it. And I don't know. I think also it being in Virginia, for the character to be coming down, it would have been, I think it was for him to he doesn't like the Deep South. He comes up with that toward the beginning. For him to make a trip all the way down to Alabama, it happened. It could have happened, but for me, it just seemed to make more sense to be in this kind of transitionary, state of Virginia, where they were kind of close to the border there.
Yeah.
What books and authors or authors inspired you to write a novel like this?
Well, I have to say, so like Charles Fraser,
Oh, sure.
hooked me early on with Cold Mountain. I read that actually. Growing up, my brother, my father, and I would go on backpacking trips, and so we were in Montgomery, and we'd often make, the several-hour drive up to North Carolina to go hiking on the Appalachian Trail and just in the Smokies because it's so beautiful.
Yeah.
So I remember my dad had given me a copy of Cold Mountain, and I was reading it when we were in the Shining Rock Wilderness area, which is one of the scenes in that book. So that was a cool experience. But I just loved how he, found all these characters within that time period in that world and tease them out or introduce you to them, all these different things that the main character gets involved in. So I just like that kind of story. I like that, I like a traveling story. I didn't necessarily want him to be traveling the whole time, but but he's pretty transient, and there's movement between towns and the region. So I like that.
It was hard to travel back then too, so it would have been a little boring,
Yeah.
All right, get one more question.
So Michael wants to know, does Solomon's map really exist?
Oh man, it's like I planted that question. So it's the Yardley Taylor map, and if you I have a Facebook and Instagram account, Scott M. Gates. If you go there, I fairly recently posted a picture from that map. So Yardley Taylor, in the book, it mentions it briefly. I mean, this is just one of those things where it just came together. You can't plan this. So I saw the map at a museum up there, and it was just a map of Loudoun County surveyed in like the 1850s. So like I said, I like being able to rely on a map when I'm moving somebody, somebody's on the road, and I had to have a good map from that time period because of the traveling he does do between towns. I just needed a good sense of it. Otherwise, I'm just totally making stuff up, So like I was interested to know if he would he be able to walk, from this town to this town in the morning, or do I have to get him? Is it going to take longer? Do I have to get him there some other way? What's he going to pass on the way? So I used that map. So that map currently there's an original version of it hanging in the Heritage Farm Museum in Loudoun County. That's where I saw it first. You can also find it if you search for Yardley Taylor map. Library of Congress has a very detailed version of it online. So one interesting thing about that, Yardley Taylor was a Quaker who lived in Lincoln, Goose Creek. It's a town that's in the book that Solomon goes to. He doesn't meet Yardley Taylor, but some in the book know of him. And also what was very handy for me was that he had at the time gone around and when he was surveying had asked landowners, would you want to be on my map? And he would charge them a little bit of money and if they wanted to. And so he put names of landowners all over the map. So for me, wanting to get things accurate, when I'm coming up with character names, I don't want to use last names at the, now we're all kind of disparate. Well, not really. I mean, you go to a certain part of North Carolina and you're going to meet a lot of people with the same last name sometimes, locals. So same thing then. So I did
the Yellow Pages then,
Well, yeah.
It was like the Yellow Pages. They're selling you ads and you're trying to get your name in, but
same idea.
I didn't know they charged you for that.
So, they mentioned in the book that, Jeb's talking about his dad. And he was like, yeah, he paid to be on the map. And my mom thought it was a vain waste of money because, why would you want your name on a map? But it did help because I was able to, like, Kirkbride is a great last name. And there were Kirkbrides in the area. So I didn't come up with that off the top of my head. Mosby is there's a very, famous Mosby, the gray ghost was up there. And a historian from that area who reviewed it early on immediately flagged it, and they were like, he's going to get confused with that Mosby. We don't, he didn't live in the same part of the county. But actually, that's a whole thing, because Jeb, his father had changed their last name. He's not a true Mosby, and he actually kind of resents the true Mosbys. So in that case, like, I was pleased to hear the historian saying that, because I was like, you're right. Like, he's not a true Mosby, and he doesn't, even really like the true Mosbys. So there's just, lots of that going on.
Well, I hope you all enjoy this book. I love the book, and I've been having a hard time concentrating, and I really did enjoy the book. I love the cover. I love the whole premise of coming out of something that was hard and overcoming it and proceeding to do great things, which is what our ancestors did. So I hope you all enjoy it. I hope you share this with all your friends. Page 158 can mail you out books. And Dave, there's a coupon code, I believe, if you could put that up there. We'll do free shipping. And I thank you so much, Blue Ink Press, and thank you all for being here. Martha, who's the favorite? Scott was the favorite, okay. And
I'm watching the comment.
yeah.
Craig did post the link to the Yardley Taylor map for those interested.
Yes,
Craig.
Thank you both for all that. And this is hard to do it this way because I don't like looking at myself. I notice I touch my face 100 times, so I'm going to go scrub up now. But Scott, you did phenomenal, and thank you so much for sharing your vision and your story with us. And we're going to try to get you the New York Times bestseller list. So buy your book from a local independent bookstore anywhere you're near, and they can order it for you. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Round of applause.
Thank you, everybody who attended. This is great. I'm so glad to be able to talk about this with everybody, and I look forward to seeing you all in person soon. So
Yes.
yeah, we can all toast
And
to it.
my husband's telling me the green buy button at the bottom too. So thank you so much, Scott. Enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers. Happy Mother's Day to all.
Yes. Happy Mother's Day. Kelly, Mom, happy Mother's Day. There's my plug.